Hi, y'all. My name is Cynthia Sartu, and I'm Executive Director of the Gulf Restoration Network. We're a network of groups that work from Texas to Florida on issues touching the Gulf of Mexico, which in the last year took on far greater significance, at least nationally, than it has ever had. This panel is going to talk to you about voices from the Gulf from injury to recovery, or restoration if that's possible. Our presenters include Dr. William Hawkins of the University of Southern Mississippi, the Gulf Coast Research Lab, Chris Dorsett of the Ocean Conservancy, Father Vien. He is the president of Mary Queen of Vietnam Community Development Corporation in New Orleans, and Callaway, the Mobile Baykeeper. To set the context for this, and I'm going to try to make this quick, but to set the context for this panel, it is very sort of personal to me that contrary to what the national sort of perception of the Gulf is that the BP Horizon disaster is somehow the first disaster that oil and gas has ever brought to the Gulf of Mexico, and that is a fallacy. It is only the latest assault on the Gulf of Mexico. All right, now this is here. Well, I guess you can't really see it, can you? I don't know why, but anyway, if you could see this, that it shows that the oil from the BP Horizon disaster went as far as Destin, Florida, and over to the shores of Texas. And although a lot of dispute is going on now for everybody who wants to deal with it only 50 miles out, it actually went hundreds of miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. This, in context, are the 3,600 structures that actually exist in the Gulf of Mexico related to oil and gas. 64% of those are in deep water already. This is our mass of pipelines in the western and central Gulf. As you can see, there's very little of the Gulf of Mexico that is not covered by pipelines in the western and central Gulf. Florida is free of it, but I'm hearing that the Florida State Legislature may approve oil and gas development in Florida soon. So they too may share this problem, and now the oil and gas interest wants to go from platforms to a vessel. It's going to be a large vessel that will hold oil and what they call lighter, which means they'll put it onto smaller oil and gas, oil vessels that will then increase navigation of oil across the Gulf of Mexico. This is the record of the oil and gas industry since 2000. If you'll notice, there were 205 spills over 205 gallons. BP had 22, Shell had 21, and Chevron had 17. 2 weeks before the BP Horizon disaster, there was an oil spill that actually took out or heavily oiled a national wildlife refuge. This is what's happened. This is what oil and gas has done to the wetlands of Louisiana. Pipeline canals and navigation canals have taken out about 40% of Louisiana's wetlands, and 30 to 60% of that loss is related to oil and gas development for people who drive cars in California, New Jersey, Massachusetts. And then, you can't see this very well, but I've heard over and over again that there were no oil spills in Katrina, which is the biggest fallacy of all. We had 44 oil spills during Katrina. 457 pipelines were damaged and nearly 11 million gallons was spilled. And so if you could see this, this is SkyTruth's picture. There was a huge sheen across the Gulf of Mexico after Katrina. Numerous platforms were taken down. So the sheen is not new to the Gulf of Mexico. It was just much larger, more dense, and now we have pollution at the bottom because of the use of dispersants. So my message to you is that you don't want your coast to look like the Gulf. We are the sacrifice zone for the oil and gas interests and the use of oil and gas in this country. And we really need help to restore our coasts. And so now I'm going to let the people of the Gulf talk to you about the problems we're facing and what restoration would actually look like. Dr. Hawkins, if you would like to come up.
Since we really haven't exactly practiced this, I don't think it matters who goes first or second. I'm Bill Hawkins. I'm the director of the Gulf Coast Research Laboratory of the University of Southern Mississippi, and I want to thank David and Cynthia for inviting me here. I wanted to put into context here the perspectives of our rather small marine laboratory in dealing with this oil spill. Can I control the slides here? Sure. You can hardly see that, but we're located in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. We're a laboratory of about 200 individuals, about 25 professional scientists. We've been around for about 60 years. We specialize in coastal and marine research. We're a member of the National Association of Marine Laboratories, and I wanted to re-emphasize that that's a collection of about 100 marine laboratories situated around the coast of the United States, and in large part really at the forefront of environmental disasters like this oil spill. We are also subject, as Cynthia mentioned, to hurricanes, so we get one disaster after another. Because of the nature of our laboratory, we do essentially marine resource research. We have large historical databases of the marine resources of the Gulf of Mexico. We're located about 100 miles, almost due north of the Deepwater Horizon site, which you can see here. Associated with us are two other laboratories that mirror us in many ways. Louisiana University's Marine Consortium in Cocodrie, and Dauphin Island Sea Laboratory on Dauphin Island, Alabama. Immediately after the spill, before the spill, life was going along pretty well. We're just about to recover from Katrina, although we're still dealing with FEMA on getting buildings lost. The day or two after the spill, we knew that we would be impacted by it, at least in our disciplines. And we created a oil spill operations team that represented essentially cross sections of what we do at the laboratory, and began to coordinate what we were doing with our own university, with the state agencies of environmental quality and marine resources, and with NOAA. And we set about on our own funding to do some intensive collecting of specimens that would both round out our historical data sets and perhaps give us some indication of what changes might be taking place once the oil reached our shores. We were, this is our research vessel, near the oil spill doing studies on larval bluefin tuna at the time of the spill, and were first to document that there were spill effects on tuna that were really just a few days or a few weeks old there. That's incontrovertible there. That certainly happened. But in our area, our main study sites would be marshes that wound up with different levels of effects of oil. We did not have nearly the marsh effects that say Louisiana had, but it did occur in the northern Gulf of Mississippi and Alabama and some of Florida, and we have a chain of barrier islands and beaches that are off the coast that range from pretty heavy oiling to really scattered oiling and tar balls. We initiated this baseline sampling to acquire the specimens we'd need for study, but also some prospective sampling that would have to do with oops, oh, missed that. That would allow us to look at molecular impacts and also toxicological impacts, and also the possibility of disease being resultant from the stress of the oil spill. During this time period, immediately after the spill, we were called on by a lot of citizens to examine samples. There was a good deal of justifiable, I'd say almost hysteria of things that you'd see normally that you would associate with the oil spill. And in our area, there were phytoplankton blooms, and we were never able to detect oil in those phytoplankton blooms. That's not to say that it wasn't having an effect on it. I'll jump to funding, and that's one of the points I want to make. National Science Foundation stepped up immediately and in their RAPID program got some funding on the street in short order. And we took major advantage of that, as did other institutions in the Northern Gulf as well as around the nation. The Northern Gulf Institute administered preliminary monies from the BP Ocean Trust Fund of $500 million that supplemented the NSF RAPID program, and I think it was a total of about $40 million that was put up by that of the $500 million that BP put on the table for the Ocean Trust Fund. Media relations. It's already been mentioned here that almost this is a historical event already. We have a very short attention span in the United States. Shortly after this, our small laboratory had approximately almost 800 print and video interviews. I'd say that in the last few months it's gotten down to almost zero. We afforded the opportunity for numerous reporters. David visited our laboratory to get out on the water and look at effects firsthand. One of the things that we did, too, that was very beneficial was, as scientists, we offered a town hall meeting in our small community that was very well attended and very well received. And the NSF-funded outreach program was also very beneficial. There was a dearth of information from scientists during this time period. Future funding sources. It's not what a lot of people think it is. There's not money falling off tables, off trees. It's not a gold mine to be in science and related to the spill these days. The National Resources Damage Assessment is really not a scientific exercise. It has more to do with litigation. We participate in that, as do some other academic research institutions. The BP Ocean Trust Fund, the Gulf Research Initiative, has approximately $500 million in it. I believe their letters of intent, they got almost 100 letters of intent. This is supposed to go for 10 years. Do the math. If it's distributed around just the Gulf states, it gets pretty small. You may be looking at funding levels for that particular program focused on this particular event that rival the funding success of NSF or NIH, which I can tell you is very competitive. We're looking at restoration funds. Some early monies have gone to the states and the agencies to begin restoration processes, and that's really in its early stages. It's been very slow to develop the plans that would feed into the NERDA process that would ultimately be expressed in restoration efforts. Other funding, we'll just have to wait and see for that. In conclusion, this is the largest oil spill, single oil spill. Cynthia's very right, that when you combine all the small spills that happen on a year-to-year basis, it gets pretty substantial. It's going to be a long-term process. People want instant results. You're not going to get instant results here. It's a commitment. It's going to take time. From the standpoint of the Gulf of Mexico, I would make the comment that it is grossly understudied. It's grossly understudied compared to many of our other bodies of water. I really can't tell you why that might be, and I would hope if there's anything that's beneficial that comes out of this, it will be a focus on this major body of water, and that for hopefully we'll know a lot more about the Gulf and how it works if there is another event like this. So thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Chris Dorsett of the Ocean Conservancy.
That's right here. Okay. So Chris Dorsett, and I direct the Gulf Restoration and Fish Conservation Program with the Ocean Conservancy, and I'm based in Austin, Texas, and very happy to be here. I'm going to present on likely impacts of the BP disaster and the marine environment in the Gulf of Mexico. and some possible restoration strategies to restore injuries to those resources, as well as go beyond the spill and address past degradation of this valuable ecosystem. So what I'm going to do in my 10 minutes is give you all a brief characterization of the oil disaster in the marine environment, look at some initial assessments of damage, some of the things that we're seeing right now in the Gulf that are rather peculiar. Third is to look at restoration strategies, and finally turn to recommendations. So it's important to remember that the BP disaster was a marine event. It happened in 5,000 feet of water, 41 miles offshore of southeast Louisiana, and in total it was 4.9 million barrels of oil that were released in the marine environment. As was mentioned, the largest unintentional oil spill in the history of the world, and certainly the largest in the U.S. The spill occurred, unfortunately, at peak spawning season time for many marine fish species and invertebrates in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as a time when there were spring migrations of birds. So timing-wise, it couldn't happen at a worse time as far as that goes. It really affected all aspects of the marine environment, from deep water and benthic habitats to the entire water column, to the surface. There was oil all over the place, including, as we all know and saw last summer, some of that oil moved inshore into the marshes where it still exists today in some spots. So I want to state up front that I'm going to show some pictures of things that we're seeing in the Gulf of Mexico right now. I can't say that they are related to the BP disaster. As Dr. Hawkins mentioned, there are formal government assessments being done right now to determine the linkage between injuries in the Gulf of Mexico and its connection to the BP disaster. So I'll show you some things that we're seeing that people are investigating, but again, we don't have that clear connection as of yet. So talked about in deep waters, just 7 miles from the wellhead, we have deep water corals in the Gulf of Mexico. And here is one that looks to be injured. So this is something that very much warrants further investigation in terms of the cause of the impact and the severity of the impact in terms of how widespread it is. And you can imagine in over 4,000 feet of water, it's not quite so simple as assessing damage in inshore, nearshore areas. It takes a lot more effort to do the kind of work necessary to really assess adequately the impacts to the Gulf of Mexico. Next, this is a foraminifera. It's a marine plankton in the Gulf of Mexico, and plankton forms the base of the food chain. There's a researcher at University of South Florida that is investigating deformities to foraminifera, which is, again, significant cause for concern and very much needs to be fully investigated to determine what exactly are causing these deformities. This is at University of Southern Mississippi. There's research underway. This is early life stage of blue crab. And you see these, let me see if I can get this to work, these orange droplets that they found under the carapace of the young blue crab. My understanding is that they have detected petroleum and dispersants that were used, unprecedented levels of dispersants that were used to disperse the oil coming from the well. This not only occurred at the surface, but it occurred directly at the source of the oil, which was in very deep water, and there was an unprecedented use of dispersants in that way in such deep water. So the latest thing that we've been seeing, fishermen have been catching and photographing some oddities with regard to some of the reef fish species in the Gulf of Mexico. My understanding is that as of right now, these fish are being spotted from roughly east of the Mississippi River down to around the Tampa-St. Pete area. This is a red snapper, and it should be all red. It shouldn't have these tiger stripes. So there's something odd going on right now, and there are researchers trying to determine what exactly is going on with these species. Here's another picture of a red snapper. Some of the other things they're seeing are lesions, fin rot, and what looks like injuries to internal organs when the fish are gutted. So again, very much trying to determine what the cause of this is. Is this something that just is occurring because of some other source of stress in the Gulf of Mexico, or is it a response to the BP disaster? This happens because the fish have been exposed to some chronic toxin in the environment, and their immune system becomes compromised, and they're then susceptible to parasites, bacteria, etc. So this is the subject of much debate in the fisheries community in the region, and I believe there'll be some plans to fully investigate the cause. And then finally, one of the reports from earlier this year were the number of baby dolphins that were washing up in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a graph from the NOAA, from National Marine Fisheries Service. You can find this on their website. They've declared an unusual mortality event for cetaceans in the Gulf of Mexico. It actually started February of 2010, so it predates the BP disaster. But what I think is of interest to people is the number of baby dolphins that we're finding stranded on the Gulf Coast. And you can see the blue bar here is historical average, or recent historical average. And then the red is levels in 2010, and then 2011 levels. Note that May is only half the month. So as Sin mentioned, the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster was just the latest insult to the Gulf of Mexico environment. The region has suffered from decades of degradation, coastal wetlands loss. Most people know about the dead zone, this area that on average is roughly the size of New Jersey, that occurs every summer in the Gulf of Mexico, where oxygen levels at the bottom of the ocean can't support life. I mean, for a lot of the key habitats, it's been losses in the 50% range as compared to historic distribution of those habitats. So one of the things that was a statement that was made by the president shortly after the disaster was that we need to go beyond the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster and address these broader sources of degradation, so that we should engage in a comprehensive restoration initiative in the Gulf of Mexico. And we fully support and agree with that. If we're going to be looking at, given that the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, the impacts were so widespread, it makes sense to just look at the system comprehensively and develop restoration plans accordingly. So I think one can easily envision, you have salt marsh habitat, you have oil that has affected that area. We do a lot of work in the Gulf of Mexico with replanting marsh grass, for example, and so one could see, directly how one might restore that particular environment. But think about things like fisheries. I mentioned at the beginning that when the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, a lot of fish were in the peak of their spawning season. So you had eggs and young larvae that are at the surface or in the water column that were impacted by the oil in some way. We still need to figure out exactly how. If that's the case, how do you directly restore those fish? I think we can look at things like hatcheries to determine if that could be of value for some species. But when you look at fisheries recovery, I think the things that you're ultimately going to have to invest in include providing better information on the abundance and distribution of these species to help ensure that management incorporates information from impacts from the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, but also has the information they need to, in a timely way, make management decisions that are going to result in sustainable fish populations. So some of the things we've identified for fish include really increasing the amount of information we have on fisheries. You know, fisheries is a pillar of the economy in the Gulf of Mexico, and as Dr. Hawkins mentioned, we don't really spend a whole lot of money to determine the health of species and provide the kind of information one would want to have in terms of managing billion-dollar economic drivers. Another key one will be restoration and protection of essential fish habitat, and this has to be from the coast out to the deep water environments. Many of the species in the Gulf of Mexico spend their early life stages in the coastal estuaries and then move out into the Gulf of Mexico spawn, and the eggs and larvae are carried back to the coastal areas. So it's really an interconnected system and needs to be treated accordingly. The dead zone is another phenomenon in marine waters, and so addressing the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico is another possible restoration strategy that we think needs to be part of the conversation. And then finally, our third will be species, threatened and endangered species, protected species like mammals, dolphins, sea turtles that we know were impacted by the disaster, protecting nesting areas, and also reducing interactions with fisheries or other sources of mortality for those species to ensure recovery. And finally, and very much agree with Dr. Hawkins' comments, that we need a system in place in the Gulf of Mexico that can take the pulse of this ecosystem. So we can better determine the health of the system. We can, to the extent we do engage in a large-scale restoration process in the Gulf of Mexico, we need to have a way to determine how we're doing in restoring the Gulf of Mexico, so that we have that information to course correct if needed. But this is absolutely critical, and the Gulf has really been underfunded over time in terms of just basic research on the health of this ecosystem. So 3 big picture recommendations. These oil-related injuries absolutely have to be fully accounted for, and this is going to be a long-term process. There are some species, long-lived species, where we might not see the impacts for a decade or more. So we need to stay committed to assessing the injury, knowing that the BP disaster story continues to become out of sight, out of mind. Restoration needs to go beyond the BP disaster, and as I said, look at the broader sources of stress to the ecosystem and address those in this process. And finally, the Sentinel system for the future. What we're supporting is a long-term endowed monitoring program, so that money is made available year after year after year to help support basic research and track performance of the restoration initiative in the Gulf of Mexico. That's it.
Next, we'll have Casey Callaway, Executive Director of the Mobile Baykeeper, talk to you about a community's approach to coastal restoration.
Well, I'm just amazed that y'all are all still awake in the dark, 9 o'clock in the morning after a party, so I'm going to try and keep it peppy, as is my strength. I'm Casey Callaway. I'm the Director of Mobile Baykeeper, and I'm not an ocean person, and as I learned last night, I'm not a fish head. but I am, and I love you, and I'm glad to be here today. Baykeeper we're an old organization, actually. We've been around 13 years, 14 years, and we grew from a tiny little fighting one chemical plant in our backyard to over 4,000 members working on issues as varied, predominantly though, land-based issues that deal with sewage treatment facilities, and stormwater has been a major component of our work over the last couple of years, and we have fought big giant road projects for our drinking water supply and a lot of home-based stuff. We are part of Waterkeeper Alliance, so because of that, we have all kinds of fabulous power and resources, which became very important over the last year. Nowhere on our radar screen did we deal with oil and offshore issues. So this was a very new year for us. The other thing we didn't do is put shovels in the ground for restoration projects. We love those organizations that do. We turn out our volunteers to their events, but that's somebody else's job until April 20th, 2010. This picture is really one that I have to show you, and I promise I don't have too many terrible ones, but I do have 3, and they're all horrible. This one I put in there because the day I realized the oil disaster was Alabama's oil disaster was a full week later. It was April 7th. It was the day that Mobile County got our code orange ozone alert. That is also the first day that we learned they were burning it. And I knew the ocean currents were out there, and somebody was in charge of that and was going to take it to Port Louisiana. I'm sorry, Louisiana. But the air, I know air, and this was coming to us. I know, I'm sorry, I'm terrible. And always have been. Sen knows me for a long, long time now. But I knew this was coming to us. And that's when I got really nervous. That's when we got active, and we went a little bit on high alert. Over time, these are some of the things that we saw. John Wathen, Hurricane Creek Keeper, who was a tremendous asset for waterkeepers, Gulf waterkeepers particularly. Please keep him and his community in your thoughts and prayers, because Hurricane Creek is ground zero for the tornadoes that went through Alabama. John took these photos, and these two I just have with me, and they're actually blown up in my office, and I have to turn them around every once in a while because I can't bear it. But this is what was happening for us. So we got involved, and we were actually, my other favorite fun story to tell you about the oil disaster is we were on May 7th presenting our final strategic plan to our board for a final vote. And my staff person walked in on like May 1st and said, so since this is over, what do you want me to do now? And we actually, because we were in such good strategic planning mode, we rewrote and we redrafted and we set up a good plan. Immediately, we've got to deal with shoreline protection. Immediately what that meant during the disaster was making sure there was boom around areas that apparently the folks who live all over the country but not in the Gulf Coast thought were important places to protect. That unfortunately was not all that was necessary to protect onshore and inshore. So we worked on that plan. But the other thing, and most importantly, we learned this immediately from our friends in Prince William Sound Keeper and Cook Inlet Keeper, was do not let them use dispersant. I have learned since this that I was the first person to say that on national television, and which underscores that I'm not very good at my job, apparently, at 1.84 million gallons later that we know of, being sent into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not going to let that small loss bother me, though. We got more work to do. But it was huge. Baykeeper also has never really worked on issues like telling folks how to live their lives, but I tell you, I've heard some of the most beautiful things here in just the 2 days, one day I've been here. Last night on the video for the background for the dance, it was, we have the power to change the nature of nature, and essentially, so why don't we not do that? And I thought that was the most powerful thing. And then this morning from the video clip of do we want to get our energy from heaven or from hell? That's pretty powerful thoughts. And those are the kind of things that Baykeeper took into account that we need to start saying around to people. But the third one is why I'm here. The third one is restoration. Again, Baykeeper doesn't do this. My very dear friend, Bill Finch, was working at the Nature Conservancy at the time. They had gotten a big grant to do oyster reef restoration, not on a small scale the way we usually do it, but on a mile-long scale. They got $4 or $5 million and they built 1.5 miles of oyster reef, or almost that much, before the disaster happened. They said, Bill called me on my one day of wagon riding with my 3-year-old and said, we need to do this, and I have a big plan. We need to do this on a scale that's unbelievable and unimaginable, and we can do it. This disaster, this unprecedented, nation's biggest environmental disaster, needs an equal response. So we came up with this. This is 101,000 Restore Coastal Alabama. And this is a template for everybody in the Gulf. This is a template for how to do restoration, and I'm so proud and so excited to tell you about it. Essentially, we're going to build 100 miles of oyster reef in coastal Alabama, and we're going to plant and promote 1,000 acres of marsh and seagrass. Now, my friend Bill Finch says we're going to do 10,000 acres, but I told him I wasn't comfortable putting that in print everywhere. Plus 1,000 is much better, much catchier. The purpose, it's vertical reef. It's not oysters to harvest in 2 years. This is build your base, build the capital, harvest the interest. This is do something bigger and big scale. These are the 4 partners that got together from the beginning, and I'll tell you why. Nature Conservancy in our area, their science, their engineering expertise is just, it's unparalleled for our area. They've also done it. They've proven it can work and shown how it will work. The Alabama Coastal Foundation is a smaller local organization, but those folks, oh my gosh, their executive director knows how to put together volunteers like you've never seen. Her research, she does everything right to make sure we work together and build community response and engagement in these issues. The Ocean Foundation, we're so proud to have as our partner. Bill Finch is now a fellow with the Ocean Foundation. They hold the money. They know how to take care of all that part of it. And then Baykeeper's involved because what we do really, really well is be loud. We are advocates and we are coalition builders, and we tell the story. I personally believe the reason we don't do more coastal restoration is because a bunch of scientists, forgive me for saying this out loud, but a bunch of scientists do it and they don't shout from the mountaintops that they're doing it, and that's my job. Why, and I'll be quick with this because hopefully you all know this already. Why oysters are the base. They're everything. They do shoreline stabilization. They do water quality. You all know one adult oyster filters 50 gallons of water a day. For us, and the reason why I jumped on this throughout the disaster is because every day was the same. Fighting the same big giant BP battle, getting thrown out of unified command, getting screamed at and yelled at, not making a difference. But what we saw with restoration is that we could. What we saw with restoration also is we could provide a home for the stressed and distressed critters that needed a vacation and a bright spot. This is a really cool slide because these are 3 different testers that the Nature Conservancy used on their original project. And I love it because, which button do I push to point? Is that the button? No. Ah! No, I'm doing it wrong. What's the pointer? Oh, the red button. Oh, the red button. This is the bagged shell is one. Bagged shell is the one fishermen are not loving because it's using shell that they want to use, but everybody has to pay for it, and it's there, and we need to use it. So we're actually it is the best place for new oysters to grow. More importantly, or as importantly to us also, this right here grew. This is new grass, new land developed from April to August of 2010. So we love this. Reef balls are the happier habitat for finfish, and the reef blocks has a little bit of challenge because of the rebar that's associated with it, and some of the fishermen are afraid of that. But it's kind of the best of both worlds. So you get both finfish and you get oyster and other mussel habitat on there. So we're going to try all 3 in all kinds of different areas, and we're going to look for additional ideas, and we see this as hitting so many different levels and so many different angles for a restoration project, not just habitat. And the oyster, this slide is one of my favorites, but everybody says that there aren't enough great pictures in here. But all of these are so connected to the oyster, because the oyster has the ability to purify the water. It has the ability to stop the effects of stormwater and sediment runoff. It has the ability to provide habitat and home and food sources for for seabirds. You name it, the oyster can be the central solution for a lot of what we're looking at. Not entirely, but because it's my primary project, it's why I like it the best. But then this is the key, and this is what I want to talk to y'all about with where we are in Alabama and where I think the Gulf Coast needs to be. It's being in a room full of people who do similar things to what I do, but not the same, and then getting to know you and figuring out what projects we can work on together. Partnerships within the environmental community are always hard because of the turf factor, or your issue slightly different from mine, or I want to be meaner than you can be and you caved in, therefore you're evil. Dumb junk like that we all have to put aside. Anybody ever been through that with any group? I've never been through it. I was told about it. Oh, not even with this project. Partnerships are the key to this. What you've got as this administrative team is Baykeeper, Alabama Coastal Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and the Ocean Foundation. We're just the workers. We're meeting every Thursday and have since probably June of last year. We are doing the groundwork for getting permits. We are doing the groundwork for applying for the grants. We are pushing NERDA. We are pushing to get the Clean Water Act funds back to the Gulf Coast states. We are involved in every angle and every aspect you can think of. We're doing the volunteer organizing. What we have is the second tier, though, are active stakeholders. Those are environmental organizations, but they're also business and economic drivers in our community, because the thing that we are saying and the thing that we are pushing and the thing that we know is we had an environmental disaster that in Alabama wrecked our economy. So everyone needs to get behind this kind of restoration, no matter what your job is, because we can make a difference if we do. The input partners are folks. Who are agencies, or anyone who's ever wanted to build a reef in their entire life or sees a great place for it, so that we can work together. And then with restoration and implementation, the thing I have to tell you that happened during this oil disaster is within 10 days, we had 7,000 people call from all over the world. I want to volunteer and help. I want to clean oiled birds. I want to clean your shorelines. I want to help. What can I do? 10 days. What we found was BP put the big shutdown on all of that. So we've had nobody be able to be involved in these projects. We want to include citizens, and I'm going to blow past this slide because I got the high note. We want to include citizens, and it's there too, though. We want to tell people that you can do something, because the number one ways, and everyone knows this is 101 for an environmental organization, people need to see it and touch it to love it. Getting people back to restoration to be able to do it themselves is what works. We've built 1/4 mile. We are one of the first states to have done restoration out of the box with private funds, the National Wildlife Federation, Alabama Wildlife Federation. We did have a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Those partners put together the first project, but it was built by 650 volunteers. There's a really phenomenal slide from space of a fireman's chain that we did that was just, it was 1/4 mile long, and with 650 volunteers. These are the partners to date, the big and you. We don't care where you live, where you are, what you're from, what you're doing. We want you to be a partner and support this project. Doesn't mean you're the only partner, doesn't mean it's the only project you love. But the more partners we have saying this is important, the stronger we have it. And we're going to leave off questions, but the one thing I do want to close with here again is there are 4 or 5 other projects that we're working on in coastal Alabama. When we are thinking about restoration, we need to think strategically together. We need to think about big restoration projects that will have meaning on as many different resources as possible. And the biggest part of that, in my opinion, is that we've got to do it by being collaborative, by talking to each other, sharing with each other, and working together. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Sid. Thank you.